We are not yet a lighthouse, but we are operating near to a lighthouse. We are operating a floating fish farm on sea in Singapore. We might not be typical fish farmers, but fish farming in Singapore is a sunset industry, and we are trying to move fish farming onto the next level, and we call that Aquaculture 4.0. What you see here is our floating fish farm work in progress. It doesn't look very elegant, but it hopefully does the job. When we were asked initially whether we wanted to do a project with Siemens to digitize and automate our fish farm operation, we were a little bit unsure where that would lead to, but we want to show you today what we've done out of it and why we think this is very interesting. I don't want to make the case for aquaculture because that's not our topic today, but maybe it's interesting to look at a few of these charts. The world clearly has a protein demand to be fulfilled by new sources, and if we want to feed the world, we cannot do that by only relying on beef, pork, poultry, because we are competing with land use and we're competing with freshwater use. We believe we have to involve sea surface and sea water. But we can also not rely on overfishing the oceans. You see that what got fished out of the oceans is stagnating, and it will continue to stagnate whatever we do about fishing. So aquaculture can close this gap. And this is interesting also because the emissions and the environmental impact of aquaculture is much lower than that, for example, of cattle or even poultry, pork, and sheep. Interesting also that the overall feed conversion rate for fish is by far the best compared with other animals that we eat. Feed conversion rate is a number without dimension, is the amount of feed that you need to get the same amount of produce. So if you need if you have a feed conversion rate of 1, you need 1 kilo of feed for 1 kilo of produce. Now, what are the challenges of conventional fish farming or conventional aquaculture? I'm just mentioning a few, and we're going to see what they have to do with our topic. Consumers more and more want to know where their food is coming from, what was done to the animals that they are eating. Were antibiotics used, other chemicals, what feed were they fed, were they always in the cold chain, how were they slaughtered, etc. We are using blockchain technology to close this and to apply a QR code on our products so consumers can check on the full history from egg to shelf for the fish fillet or the whole fish that they're eating. Optimize fish feed. There are two issues here. One issue is the sustainability of fish feed. Fish eat feed that is mainly produced with fish meal that comes from other fish. And currently you're taking more out of the ocean than you give back by growing fish in aquaculture. So we have to find new sources for fish feed. That's a topic that's indirectly related to here. I just wanted to mention it. The other question regarding feed. Feed is the most important cost factor in aquaculture, and we have to make sure that what we feed will be eaten, and what will be eaten will be also transformed into produce. So overfeeding or inefficient feeding needs to be avoided, and we need to know how we can do that. If we don't want to use antibiotics, and I know people who are happy that they can mix the antibiotics already in their feed. Look at the poultry production in the US. look at many other areas. If you don't want to do that, you need to have other means to avoid that fish or animals get sick. Clean water, no parasites, the right mix of bacteria, no viruses, etc. And that gets me to the next topic, predictive and reactive disease control. If you want to successfully run aquaculture, you have to know early when your fish gets sick, because then you have a chance to react. Environmental pollution. Whatever you have as waste in your aquaculture operation should not be given back to the ocean as such. And also, you have to separate the pollution that is outside in the water from what is available for your animals, for your fish. So you have to create some sort of closed containment system that separates the water in your tanks for your fish from the water outside. Finally, and that's of course our topic today, you need data. If you talk to 8 people on your fish farm, what's wrong or what's good with your operation, you get 8 different anecdotal stories. They tell you, oh, this food, no good. The fish don't like it. Or they tell you, the fish came from that hatchery, thus that hatchery doesn't have any good fish. Then they tell you, oh, too many fish in the tank. The fish are not happy, they are stressed. What I'm trying to say, in an operation like ours, there are many factors that define success or failure. And to rely your decisions on anecdotal evidence is not leading to success. You need data, and you need the interpretation of these data. A short history of Industry 4.0, and we are not in a history class here, but the interesting point is, and that was mentioned before, aquaculture has the unique option to leapfrog, the famous word used before also from our colleagues from McKinsey, to leapfrog from the second industrial revolution to the fourth. If you look at traditional fish farming around the region, you are somewhere between the second and the third industrial revolution. But what we want to do is we want to get to a level of Industry 4.0 applied on aquaculture. So you can leapfrog from second to the fourth industrial revolution. What is the main shift? What is the main change that is interesting for us? It's the use of data. Even in the third industrial revolution, most of the data were recorded, were analyzed, and led to conclusions and action long after the effect as such. What we are trying to do is we try to use data in control cycles in real time, and ideally without our own interference. Looking at this picture from Siemens, you see some of the components that are used in Industrial 4.0, and interestingly enough, we are using at least four of these elements in our application that I'm showing you now. So basically, what we are trying to do is we're trying to marry aquaculture and Industry 4.0 and create Aquaculture 4.0. Here we go. On the left, you see our fish in the tank. And traditionally, of course, you would operate pumps, feeding systems, you would pre-program them, and you would give them a certain routine and sequence. What we are doing now is we apply all kinds of sensors and monitoring equipment onto these fish tanks and monitor what's happening. What is the dissolved oxygen that the fish need? How is our water flow? How is our water quality? How much energy do we consume? And we film all that with video images. Those video images play a very important part because we use visual data analytics to do what other people do as face detection, we do as fish detection. We don't detect the fish species because we only work with one in each tank, but we detect the fish size. And that is very important, because if we know the fish size and the change of the fish size, we know how much the fish are growing, how much biomass is in the tank, what pellet size the fish would like to eat, and how much they have to eat per day. All these data that we are collecting are then transferred in a cyber-secure cloud-based system, in this case from Siemens, called MindSphere, excuse me. And we work with these data using partially artificial intelligence and other intelligence instruments. We use algorithms and we transform these data into a dashboard, which is the interface for the people operating the farm. So when you were looking at the traditional fish farmer, then what you find now in a control room at the bottom right of this slide here, you see a completely different person sitting there. It's more like in a control room of a big industrial setup. So you also need different skills, and you offer a much more interesting job for people who want to work in aquaculture, which is interesting also for us here in Singapore. And finally, you use all the tools of data analytics and data engineering to now run your operation. Run your operation meaning if the fish want to eat, they need more oxygen, so you give them more oxygen. If they're digesting, you give them more oxygen for the period that they were digesting. If you feed them and the activity level of the fish is low, you stop feeding, so you avoid overfeeding. And finally, if you want to improve your water quality, you increase the speed of your pumps and pump more water through your tank in order to achieve that. If you look at the MindSphere cloud, you see the database, and that's something also in the future which is interesting for us. This database is open for many farms, not only for one farm. And these data can be collected for many farms who would using similar software tools as we do. And from these data over time, we find out what works best. We can develop industry benchmarks, if you want, and best practice information. The project timeline, if you looked at the challenges, might be not that interesting, so I go quickly through this and show you some of the dashboards, the slides that we use. So, our fish farm technician, but also the decision maker on his tablet, somewhere with Wi-Fi connection, can look at 5 different slides or screens actually. And this one is now showing all the tanks on our floating fish farm. We have alarms if some parameters are critical. For example, if the oxygen level in a tank is too low, or if the water level is too low. So we show historically those alarms, and there can be a soft alarm, which is like an orange color, or it can be a serious alarm, which is red. Then you know you have to do something. But you also get, with a traffic light indication system here, for every tank, either a green or an orange or red color that shows you other things, such as mortality, disease, problems with water quality, etc. So a lot of these data that we were collecting before with our sensors are shown in this screen. This is a real video stream from one of our tanks. And the camera that I spoke to before films those fish. Other companies can do that too, and they have then a person sitting there pressing a button, then the feed will fall into the tank and he sees how the fish are reacting. If you have 10 tanks, you might want to do that. If you have 100 tanks, you might not want to do that, and you have to do that 4 times a day. In addition, since we're working with relatively clear water, the camera is able to detect the fish size, as I mentioned before. The camera is also able to detect with algorithms and artificial intelligence if there are certain fish that are sick. If they turn to the side and flashing, you can see the reflection. If they're separating from the school, that's a warning sign. If they have a funny swimming behavior, that is a virus that affects the brain. All these things can be monitored and found out, and they lead to an alarm. We have some other elements here like weather information that is more interesting for energy management. The picture of that floating fish farm I showed you is covered with solar panels, and depending on the weather forecast we know whether we can rely on sun the next day or we have to charge our batteries from the genset to have the generators working in the sweet spot, etc. In summary, in our view, doing all this means that we can increase our productivity or the efficiency of our operation. The digitized data that we collect in our process help us to increase our efficiency, and I give you some examples. The first one is the oxygen. We measure the oxygen level in the tank, and we know when fish eat, they need more oxygen. So before a feeding cycle, a few minutes before, we increase already the oxygen level and we leave it at a high level, let's say for 2 hours after feeding. This is done automatically because we measure the demand and we have an interface, the machine talking to each other in an IoT environment, the camera system with the feeder, and we increase or decrease oxygen supply on demand. We are doing that to have ideal metabolic conditions for the digestion of the feed, but also in order not to waste oxygen. We want to supply exactly as much oxygen as we need. Each kilo of oxygen costs 20 cents, and if you want to produce 1,000 tons per year, you know how wasteful it could be if you are constantly oversupplying oxygen. On the other hand, if you're undersupplying oxygen, you stress your fish and you allow disease to creep in. You also want to avoid that. A second example is the digitized input for the water quality. You want to have self-cleaning abilities in your tanks. That's mainly an effect of the hydrodynamics of your water swirl. And you can increase or decrease the water flow, as mentioned before. You reduce manual labor with that, and you reduce parasites or anything that can cause disease in the tanks by doing so. Looking back at the visual data analytics, what the camera is telling us the average body weight of the fish. That helps us to define the feed size, the feed amount, but it also tells us many other information that we need. First, the activity level of the fish. If the fish are no longer that hungry and active, you stop feeding to avoid overfeeding. But you also know if fish would be sick. In fish farming and in any aquaculture operation, disease is a given. You're always dealing with disease, but you have a chance to do something about it if you react early as possible. That's why you have to detect it early, and the camera helps with that. Finally, the camera system tells you all the calculative data that you need, your growth rate, your FCR, anything that you can calculate based on the average body weight and its changes over time. And with that, you're opening the avenue to management by data. You are actually in control of your operation. You identify, instead of anecdotal evidence and impression, you identify with real data what works and what doesn't work. Now, ending this presentation, you might ask yourself, does it work for us? The answer is, we're going to see. But my question would be, can it work without this investment and without that step towards Aquaculture 4.0? And that is an answer that goes in the direction of the casino in Singapore. It might or it might not. But if you want to do serious aquaculture, we believe you need that support with technology, and that's why we are going this way towards Aquaculture 4.0. Thank you very much for your interest.